The London tournament of 1883 was arguably the first real chess tournament using double-sided chess clocks. It was a round-robin tournament with each of the 14 players matched twice against their opponents, and Johannes Zuckertort ultimately won with 22 games. Uh, this first game is that of Henry Bird versus Joseph Blackburne, and it begins with a move which is now known as Bird's Opening. Of course, the joke here is that Bird's Opening is on the F file, making it a somewhat obscene gesture. Honestly, it's not an opening I would recommend for any of my students, as D4 or E4 are much better. Indeed, Blackburne will win this game. He continues with a E6. This makes sense, and it appears to be an effort to prevent white from advancing to F5, which I don't think that would be a good move anyways. It's not really necessary. I think it would have been better for Blackburne to have played knight F6, just to try and control E4 and keep white from doing what he should have done to begin with. But who am I to criticize Joseph Blackburne? White now plays knight F3. Here you can see Bird's plan. He has pushed the F pawn out as a sort of shield for the knight. However, honestly, this isn't really necessary, and white should definitely play more aggressively. There are a lot of situations that I would recommend my students adopt a similar plan with C4 followed by knight C3. However, on the king side, white should really just leave the F pawn where it started. Now for black, I would recommend C5 in order to start controlling the center. However, Blackburne just doesn't want to play the way I think he should. Instead, he fianchettos the queen's bishop, and I don't really generally recommend this idea to my students either, as it takes two moves and accomplishes really quite little. White now plays E3, another kind of passive move, and there's bishop B7, knight C3. I also don't agree with black's fourth move, D5. I mean, it really just blocks in the bishop. Why go to all the trouble of getting the bishop there and then just block it with a pawn? White now plays D4. When I kind of first started playing chess years and years ago, I really kind of liked this sort of setup. I thought it was really nice to have the two pawns here and then bring the knight up, and I thought it was really solid. And I really loved games where then black would play F5 and they'd get their knight out, and there'd be two knights in the center and a circle of pawns, and it looked cool, but honestly I don't think it's very good. But in the late 19th century, that appears to have been somewhat kind of a popular little idea. Instead of playing F5, which black shouldn't play, Blackburne just brings out his knight to F6. And now white plays something which I also generally discourage my students from playing, A3. And the idea is to keep that bishop from coming up to B4 and then pinning the knight. A lot of people are afraid of this pin, and they're worried that a bishop's going to pin their knight. But I always say let them pin your knight if they really want. Like what's the big deal? To spend a whole move on this A3, there's got to be something better you can play here. Like bishop D3 would have made a lot more sense here. Like there's just don't be afraid of your opponent. But he does play A3. Now bishop E7. Part of the problem with A3 is what if black was going to play bishop E7 all along? Then you're playing A3 for nothing, right? Now finally bishop D3. Now knight BD7, and here you can kind of see what black's plan is going to be. Is he wants to play the knight to E4, and then he can bring the other knight up to F6 as reinforcement. And then he's got the bishop and the pawn to sort of defend the knight on e4. And then, of course, if white were to take on e4, then black's recapture with the pawn will fork the other knight and the bishop. White castles, and black plays knight e4, hoping, of course, for knight takes e4. White now plays knight e5, and black castles. And now that there's no longer a knight on f3, white can take on e4. Then black takes the white knight. So that's kind of the end of the opening there, I would say. And here at this point, black should, definitely play c5. If white takes on c5, that'd be great, because then these pawns would be weak, and the black bishop can have this really nice position here on c5. Black's I guess a little hesitant to do that, but he prepares it with rook c8, which you don't really need that extra pressure. In fact, I've got this pawn highlighted with an arrow. Really, the bishop alone is sufficient to support c5, so he doesn't need any more pieces on this. White plays c3. I suppose the idea is after c5, if the c pawn were to take, then this pawn can retake. Now black plays a move which I don't know what he was thinking here. Queen d7. Don't know where that queen thinks it's going. And bishop d2. And now finally c5. And here white should probably play a4, because that would allow his bishop to then be posted on b5 and attack this queen here. Instead, white plays rook f4. He's played real passive so far, but now he's kind of getting aggressive. Although, if you look at it, like I don't know what kind of attack he thinks he's going to have here. So it's really just kind of a wasted move. Like, wow, you played a rook up here. What good is that? And black could really just ignore that. I think, as I've indicated with the arrows here, I think rook cd8 is probably the best move. Like, this file is probably going to open up, so it'd be good to get a rook posted here. Another idea which he does play is bishop g5. Just attack that rook that came out there for no reason. And really, white should probably just retreat with the rook and go back where he came from. And instead, he sort of doubles down on his idea. He plays rook g4. Yes, it attacks the bishop, but that's easily dealt with. I think queen e7 is the best move, because you can get that queen off the d file, and then you can slide a rook over. Instead, black plays bishop h6. Little weaker, I think, but it's not terrible. And now I don't like white's next move, rook g3. What I don't think that really accomplishes much. It would have been much better to play queen e1 and then try to get the queen into this, because whatever white's going to do here, the rook alone is certainly not going to be enough to do it. But he just plays rook g3 instead. And I think black's best move is probably g6, because the rook's going to have a real hard time trying to crack through that pawn there, and then it also increases the scope for this bishop. What black does play is f5. That's fine as well. White pretty much has to take the pawn en passant, otherwise black's gonna have this real solid sort of pawn structure here that later, if he wants, he can push up and cause all kinds of trouble. So white does take there, and black retakes, and black's definitely got an advantage here where he can pretty much control the f file. White now plays queen b3. It looks kind of good because it's attacking this awkward e6 pawn and pinning that to the king. It's really not that great though. It's really easy for black to deal with this. Bishop d5 obviously would work good. I think bishop c6 is a little better because that's sort of preparing the idea of bishop a4 and attacking that queen. Instead he plays a fairly natural move. I think it's fine as well. Rook cf8, just double down on that file. And white now plays a move which I don't think really accomplishes very much at all. Rook e1. Well, I mean, obviously he's trying to defend this bishop, and as you see, black is gonna jump down there onto f2. I don't know. Maybe here this would have been better, but black's got a definite advantage regardless here now. And there's rook f2. I mean, it looks really good, and certainly black is better, but maybe it would have been better just play something like g6 here, because the rook on f2 alone, like it's not really obviously going to take anything there, but it's certainly a good square for the rook. And there's queen d1. Black trades some pawns in the center. And there's finally bishop d5. Bishop b4 attacking the rook, but of course the rook can just move and dodge that. And here white should definitely play rook f1 and try to challenge black on the f file. He doesn't. He plays a interesting move, and at first it looks quite bad, but there is a method to his madness. He plays bishop a6, and it looks bad because it definitely exposes this b2 pawn. But the real idea with bishop a6 is to clear out for the queen to come down to h5. And black should probably just take the free pawn, but what he tries to do, it's not as good, but it's not bad either. b5 is an attempt to trap that bishop now, because it is going to be kind of awkward with that bishop there. And here comes queen h5, and of course the pawn on g7 is pinned, so white is threatening to win a bishop there. But black has his own threat. Bishop c5 or bishop c4 is threatening rook f1, which will lead to checkmate. So white plays h3 to create some space for his king to escape. And that undefends the rook on g3. So black here is now really exposing the weakness of white's king side, and I'd like to point out the pressure on this f file. White started with f4, and I often find that people who move their king bishop pawn, which is generally not advisable, when they start losing, there's a lot of pressure on the f file, and this is a good example of that. It's just not a good idea in most cases to move that king bishop pawn. And you can see right here, all of a sudden there's a rook right where that pawn should be. So white's going to defend the rook with king h2, but of course now the rook is pinned, and that allows black to come down to f5, attacking the queen. And if the queen were to run away, then black can play rook to g5 and snag the pinned rook. So white's pretty much forced now to trade, and he's going to lose an exchange. Take the bishop, and then queen takes rook, and king takes queen, and pawn takes queen. And so black is now up in exchange. And white now plays bishop d6, and the idea seems to be to park that bishop on f4 to stop white's rooks from coming back down to f2. But black's got an even better idea here. Rook g5 check. And if the king were to go to h2, then he's going to have rook to f2 and a lot of pressure on that g2 pawn, so the king goes to h4. But that loses the pawn anyways. And it attacks that undefended b3 pawn. And white deals with this by playing b3. And of course, if white were or black were to take on b3, then the b5 pawn would fall. And I think probably his best move is just play bishop d3, but what he plays is bishop e2, and that's got a checkmate threat in there, moving the rook up to f5 and then over to h5. And white plays rook c1 so that he can come down to c5 and contest the fifth rank. And there's rook f5, there's rook c5. Now here, interesting idea for black would have been b4, which exposes these bishops to attack. If white just takes, then the rook can come over and it can hit the e3 pawn. And if white doesn't want to take, you might play bishop c8. Rook takes, bishop takes, something like that. So b4 would have been playable. What black actually plays is rook g to g5. Rook takes, rook takes. There's a4. I mean, that doesn't really seem to help much, but white's already losing. Of course, the idea is if, pawn takes pawn, then white's going to take the bishop. So black just plays back to bishop d3. And here, white could take that b5 pawn, but then his pawns really aren't going to go anywhere. It's probably better to play what he did play, which is just push the pawn forward. And then at some point, if this a7 pawn falls, then he can try to advance and queen the a pawn. Rook f3. That e3 pawn is definitely undefended. And now this is kind of a clever move. Bishop c5. And if white were to take the pawn, that would actually give white some good drawing chances. Rook takes e3, d5. And the rook's got to move now d6. So that's the idea with bishop c5. White's got a better idea though here. Bishop f1. Of course, that's threatening checkmate again. I mean, it's not threatening checkmate right away, but it's certainly threatening to win a pawn. And then there's a bishop takes a7, clearing out for that a pawn, and bishop takes. Bishop to b8 is played to clear additional space for the a pawn. Rook takes pawn. Bishop b7. That a pawn is now looking pretty good. And here is bishop f5. And now now black is threatening a checkmate. And white defends against that with bishop g3, blocking the rook's line of attack, but black can go on to take the b pawn. And now d5. No, black doesn't want to take on d5 because then bishop takes d5, check wins the rook. And here, black could just win simply by playing e3. It's gonna be hard to stop that even with this bishop here. Let's see. See, now the rook could just sacrifice right there and take that. So definitely think you should play e3, but rook a3 is still winning. And d6. Now here, really good move for black is e5. Much better than e3. After e5, now you're really shutting down any possibility of this d pawn coming forward. And if black takes the pawn, there's an immediate rook h3 checkmate. So e5 would have been good. Black plays king to f7. And that's a really bad mistake. Much better would have been e5 or e3 at least, but king f7, Bird could have come back and gotten a draw out of this. All he has to do is push the d pawn forward. And black really can't stop that, because if he plays king to e7, which you would normally think if the king slides over it's going to control d8, white has bishop to d6 check, and it forks the king and the rook. And so then if the king takes the bishop, then the pawn queens. And if he doesn't take the bishop, then the bishop takes the rook. So d7 would have been a great move here for Bird. He doesn't play it though, we just didn't see it. Plays e6 or a6. And now black finally plays the e5 idea. And now it's really pretty much over, and white resigned after a few more moves.